The hill is called Walker's Creek. It is the 8th of June 1844. And on the ridgeline above a small band of tired men, something is moving that should not be there. 75 Comanche warriors, painted, mounted, silent, watching 15 white men who have stopped to cut a bee tree for honey. The rangers do not see them yet. One of them, a boy named Alexander Coleman, is watching the trail behind. He sees the first rider, then the second, then the sky fills with them. The warriors do what they have always done. They form a line on the top of the hill. They show their numbers. They wait for the white men to panic, to race for cover, to fire their long rifles once and then sit helpless while arrows fall on them like rain. That is how the fight always goes. That is how it has gone for 100 years. Except today. Today is different because these 15 men are not cavalry. They are not militia. They are not even soldiers in any real sense of the word. They are Texas Rangers. And what they carry in their belts is a thing no warrior on this continent has ever seen. A Comanche survivor many years later would try to explain what happened that afternoon to a man who wrote it down. He used a phrase that has echoed through Texas history ever since. He said they had a shot for every finger on the hand. To understand what he meant and why that single sentence still matters, you have to go back before the Rangers had revolvers. Back before the frontier had a name. Back to a moment when two peoples, the Apache and the Texan, first looked at one another across open ground and tried to decide whether to fight or to shake hands. This is the story of what they said to each other, the words that survived, the words that were written down and the words that were not. The year is 1838. The Republic of Texas is 2 years old, broke and bleeding. A new government has been stitched together out of rebellion and debt. And it has one enormous problem. It does not control its own land. West of San Antonio, past the last white farmhouse, the map of Texas dissolves into something else. Comanche country, Lipan country, Mescalero country, country that belonged to the people who had been there for longer than anyone could remember. Country where European laws meant less than a whisper in a dust storm. And in that country, two kinds of Apache lived, the Lipan, the easternmost of all the Apache bands. In their own language, they called themselves Way and the Light Gray People. Their lands ran from east of San Antonio down to the Rio Grande and across the river into Coahuila. They had lived in Texas for centuries. They had already survived the Spanish. They had already survived the Mexicans. And to the west of them, the Mescalero, the people of the Mezcal plant. They ranged through the Guadalupe Mountains and into what is now New Mexico, tougher country, drier country, the kind of country that made the men who lived in it lean and quiet and very, very patient. Both of these peoples had an enemy. And it was not the Texan. It was the Comanche Empire, because that is what historians now call it, an empire. A vast network of horse-mounted bands that dominated the southern plains from Colorado to Chihuahua. They had pushed the Apache off the plains. They had driven the Spanish out of their forts. They raided where they pleased and returned where they pleased, and no Mexican or American army had found a way to stop them. The Lipan remembered their grandfathers had been plains buffalo hunters. Now they lived along rivers and in hill country pushed south by the Comanche generation after generation. They had lost land. They had lost people. They had lost their place in the world. So when the first Anglo colonists arrived in the 1820s, the Lipan did something that history has not always understood. They looked at these strangers and they made a calculation. The enemy of our enemy. In 1838, a Lipan chief named Quelgust Castro rode into the town of Live Oak Point and signed his name to a treaty with the young Republic of Texas. The treaty promised peace and perpetual friendship between his people and the Texans. It was a gamble. Castro could not have known it was a gamble he would lose. But in that moment, on that day, it must have seemed like the only move left on the board. Because here is something the textbooks often forget. Before the Texas Rangers ever fought the Apache, they rode with them. The name of the man changes everything that happens next. John Coffee Hayes, called Jack by his friends, called Devil Jack by the men who feared him, called Bravo too much by the one man in Texas whose opinion he trusted above his own. Hayes arrived in Texas in 1836. He was 19 years old, 5 feet 9 inches tall, fair-skinned, soft-spoken, Not the kind of man you would look at twice in a crowd. One of his own rangers, a man named Nelson Lee, described him as a slim, slight, smooth-faced boy, not over 20 years of age and looking younger than he was. In fact, he carried a letter of recommendation from Andrew Jackson. He was related by marriage to the Jackson family. And Sam Houston, the president of the new republic, took one look at him and signed him into the Texas Rangers. By 1840, at the age of 23, Hayes was a captain, and he commanded a company of men that did not look like any army that had ever ridden out of San Antonio before. Anglo-Tejanos, Lipan Apache scouts, Mexican volunteers, all riding together, all carrying different weapons, all following one very small, very quiet man who seemed to understand something about war that nobody else had figured out yet. His closest friend among the scouts was a man the Texans called Young Flaco, a Lipan war leader, the son of a Lipan chief, one of the finest horsemen on the Texas frontier. Nobody knows exactly what Flaco looked like. No photograph was ever taken, but we know what Jack Hayes thought of him because Hayes wrote it down. He wrote that Flaco was tall and erect with well-shaped limbs. He said Flaco gave an impression of bounding elasticity. He wrote about a circlet of eagle feathers set back on his forehead, one about dark eyes and a bearing of fierce alertness coupled with strength and agility. He said Flaco moved like the hawk and the panther. These are the words of a soldier, but they're also the words of a man describing someone he loved. And Flaco had his own word for Jack Hayes, according to the Rangers who heard him say it. Young Flaco once said this in a mixture of broken Spanish and English about the small, quiet captain he rode beside. Me and Red Wing not afraid to go to hell together. Captain Jack, heap, brave, not afraid to go to hell all by himself. That line became famous. It got repeated so often by so many writers that it passed out of history and into myth. But if you stop and listen to it carefully, it tells you something important. It tells you that the first thing an Apache warrior said about a Texas Ranger, the very first documented opinion we have, was not fear. It was not hatred. It was admiration. Flaco was describing a friend. And that matters because what came later, what turned the Apache and the Texan into mortal enemies, did not come from this moment. It came from everything that happened after. Before we go on, if you are finding this story worth your time, I would be grateful if you would take a second and subscribe to the channel. What I do here is spend weeks digging through primary sources, old letters, out-of-print memoirs, and archival documents so that stories like this one get told properly. If that is the kind of thing you care about, stick around. There's a lot more to come. Now, let us go back to Walker's Creek. 19 days before the fight, May 1844, San Antonio. Jack Hayes walks out of the Texas Navy quartermaster's office carrying something that will change the history of this continent. He does not know it yet. Nobody does. The Republic of Texas, in its desperate poverty, has just disbanded its tiny navy, and the Navy has been selling off its equipment. Among the things for sale, a shipment of strange pistols purchased back in 1839. They were called Colt Pattersons, made in a factory in Patterson, New Jersey, by a young inventor named Samuel Colt, who was on the edge of bankruptcy. The U.S. Army had rejected them. The state militias had rejected them. They were unproven, expensive, and built with a folding trigger that some soldiers found fussy. But they did one thing no other handgun in the world could do. They fired 5 shots without reloading. Hayes bought 30 of them, maybe more. The records are unclear. He handed them out to 15 of his Rangers, 2 apiece, plus spare cylinders, 10 shots before reloading. 15 if a man was quick with his hands. And then he did something strange. He did not ride out to fight with them immediately. He trained through the rest of May. Hayes drilled his men on horseback. How to fire at a gallop. How to reload a cylinder without dismounting. How to ride in pairs so one man covered the other while he changed cylinders. How to charge, which nobody in 100 years of frontier warfare had ever charged Comanche cavalry and lived. On June the 1st, 15 men rode out of San Antonio. Hayes, Samuel Walker, who would one day give his name to the most famous pistol in the American West. Ben McCulloch, Ad Gillespie, Noah Cherry, Peter For, who would not ride home, and 10 others. They went looking for a raiding party that had been hitting settlements south of the Panals River, Comanches, or so they thought. maybe led by a war chief named Yellow Wolf. For a week, they found nothing. They rode north between the Panels and the Llano, and when they turned back towards San Antonio, they followed an old Indian trail called the Pinta Trail. On the afternoon of June the 8th, they stopped to rest near a small waterway, Hayes called Walker's Creek, about 50 miles above the town of Sieg, a shaded place, scrubby live oaks, and blackjack brush. A few of the men dismounted to cut open a bee tree for honey. And that is when Alexander Coleman, riding rear guard, saw the first Comanche appear on the trail behind them. 15 against 75. Bows, lances, trade muskets on one side, new pistols on the other. Not good odds for the Texans, especially because the Comanche had done the math long before the Texans had. A Comanche warrior could loose 5 arrows in the time it took a frontiersman to reload a single muzzle-loading pistol. That was the rule. That was the rule for 100 years. Plains warfare was built on that rule. What the Comanche did next, they had done 100 times before. They formed a line on top of the hill. 75 warriors. They showed themselves. They made noise. They expected the Rangers to do what white men always did, which was to race for cover, fire their rifles, and start dying slowly while the Comanche circled. Hayes looked up at the hill. He studied the ground for a moment, and then he gave an order that nobody on either side was prepared for. He charged. The 15 Rangers spurred their horses forward. The hill was steep and overhanging so that as they reached the base they were hidden from the Comanche on top. Hayes used that. He wheeled his men around the curve of the slope, rode 200 or 300 yards out of sight and came up the hill from a different direction entirely. When the Rangers appeared on the ridge, they came up on the Comanche flank. The Comanche had dismounted. They were kneeling, guns and arrows ready. Waiting for the frontal charge that any fool could see was the only attack these white men could possibly make. And instead, the Rangers came from the side. What happened next, in the words of Benjamin McCulloch, who lived through it, was soon hand to hand. The Rangers fired their long rifles first, then they drew the pistols, and the pistols did not stop. 5 shots from one cylinder, 5 more from the second pistol, 5 more after a quick cylinder change. 15 rounds in the time it should have taken to fire 2. The Comanche had planned for a fight of a certain shape and length, a fight they had fought their entire lives, a fight their fathers had fought. Now they were inside something that had no shape they recognized. Peter went down hit by an arrow. He would die of his wounds. 4 other Rangers were wounded, including Samuel Walker, who took a Comanche lance through the body and was not expected to live. He did. Arrows filled the air. Mary Maverick, a San Antonio settler who heard the story directly from Hayes himself 12 days later, wrote in her diary that several thousand arrows were fired into their midst. Arrows passed through the Rangers' hats and coats and saddle blankets, but the fighting had turned. And then a thing happened that decided the whole battle. Hayes, bleeding and running low on ammunition, shouted to his men, "Any man who has a load, kill that chief." One of the Rangers, Ad Gillespie, answered, "I'll do it." Gillespie dismounted. He steadied his long rifle, the one they called a jagger. He took aim at a figure in the Comanche line. A man the warriors were gathered around, a leader, and he fired. The chief fell, and at that moment something broke in the Comanche line. The warriors who had not yet been killed or wounded turned their horses and rode. Hayes and his surviving men chased them for 3 miles, firing from the saddle the whole way, something no white force had ever been able to do before in this country. 20 Comanche dead by the lowest count, 50 by the highest, many more wounded. The Rangers had lost 1 man. And now we come to the sentence, the one that started this whole story. Because the Comanche did what they had always done after a battle. They carried their stories home. They told the people who were waiting for them what had happened in the scrub oaks on the hill above Walker's Creek. And years later, one of those survivors told a white man who wrote it down. He said the Rangers had a shot for every finger on the hand. Think about what that sentence means. It is not a sentence of defeat. It is a sentence of discovery. The discovery of a new kind of weapon and a new kind of enemy. For the Comanche and soon for the Apache, who heard the story too, this was the moment when the rules of the frontier changed. For 100 years, the mounted warrior had been the undefeated lord of open ground. The European foot soldier was slow. The European horseman could not reload. The single-shot pistol was a dead weight once it was fired. Now, something else was on the field. Hayes sent a report to the Republic of Texas. It was short, and in it he wrote a line that would eventually make Samuel Colt a rich man. I cannot recommend these arms too highly. Samuel Walker survived his lance wound. In 1846, he traveled back east and met Samuel Colt in New York. Together, over a few weeks, they designed a new version of the pistol, bigger, 6 shots instead of 5. A weapon a cavalryman could actually rely on. They called it the Colt Walker. Colt, in gratitude, had a scene engraved on the cylinder of every Walker pistol manufactured, a scene of Hayes and his Rangers fighting Comanches on horseback. Colt got the uniforms wrong. He drew them as U.S. Drayens. But the scene was Walker's Creek. Every Colt revolver that was ever sold, every peacemaker, every single-action army, every cowboy pistol in every Western you have ever watched traces its bloodline back to one small hill in Texas. And one sentence spoken by a Comanche warrior who had just seen something he could not explain. A shot for every finger on the hand. But this is a story about the Apache. And the Apache were still watching. Word of Walker's Creek traveled fast. Traders carried it. Mexican vaqueros carried it. Captured raiders carried it. Within a year, there was not a warrior in West Texas who had not heard some version of what had happened. The Lipan, already allied with the Rangers, learned of it first. Young Flaco rode with Hayes on some of the skirmishes that came after. He saw the new pistols in use. He saw what they did. According to Hayes, Flaco called Hayes's revolver a gun that has the thunder inside it. For a brief window of time, it looked as if the Lipan and the Rangers might have made it. Not as equals. Nothing on the frontier was ever equal, but as partners, as allies, as two peoples fighting a common enemy. Sam Houston wrote in his personal correspondence after hearing news that Flaco had ridden with the Rangers once again. The name of Flaco brought joy to all hearts. And then in the winter of 1842, young Flaco disappeared. He had been serving under General Alexander Somerville in the Republic's expedition to the Rio Grande, the expedition against the Mexican invasion of that year. Young Flaco performed scout duty. He chased Mexican forces from Galad to the border. When the fighting was over, he started back towards San Antonio with some horses he had gathered. He never arrived. What happened to young Flaco became one of the bitter mysteries of Texas history. The Republic of Texas officials told the Lipan that he had been killed by Mexican bandits. Others said it was Cherokees. 6 Cherokee bodies were reportedly found near his. But Flaco's father, the elder Chief Flaco, did not believe any of it. He searched. He asked questions. He listened to the stories and he came to a conclusion. His son had been killed by white settlers, Anglo, the same people his son had fought alongside for 6 years. Sam Houston wrote the chief a letter. He tried to give comfort. He wrote that the Texans would be kind to the Lipan. Grass shall not grow in the path between us. And the old chief, broken with grief, wrote back that he no longer wished to be called Flaco. He asked to be called Senor Yanni, a name nobody outside the Lipan ever understood the meaning of. One historian writing a century later would say something remarkable about this moment. He would write that if the killers of young Flaco had ever been caught and punished, the Apache wars that consumed Texas for the next 40 years might never have started. We do not know if that is true. We only know what happened instead. After Flaco the Younger's death, something began to shift in how Texans wrote about the Apache. For 20 years, the Lipan had been allies, treaty partners, welcomed into San Antonio, invited in some cases to dine with the Republic's government officials. Chief Flaco himself had been a common sight in early Austin, a guest at dinners. But the settler population was growing, and growing settlers needed land, and land, whether it was Comanche land or Lipan or Mescalero land, was all the same to a man with a plow and a title deed. A Lipan man now found himself blamed for raids that had been carried out by other tribes. A Comanche raid in Medina County would end with Texan fingers pointing at the Lipan camp on the river. A cattle theft on the Guadalupe and someone would decide it was the Apache. In 1841, Chief Flaco the Elder and Chief Cuelgas de Castastro were arrested in Austin. They were accused of a murder that had been committed against a settler named James Boyce. The chiefs denied it. They were held in jail until proof emerged that the killers had actually been Comanche. That proof came. The chiefs were released, but something did not go back into its box. Something had been broken. By the mid-1840s, the old Treaty of Live Oak Point was dying. Nobody in the new American state of Texas remembered or cared to remember what it had said. When Texas joined the United States in 1845, the Republic's old treaties with the Lipan simply stopped mattering. The United States government had its own treaty system, its own plans for Indian removal. And in 1859, when the federal government and the state of Texas decided to push the remaining reservation peoples out of the state entirely, the Lipan did what Apache had always done when the ground beneath their feet turned against them. They crossed the Rio Grande. They went to Mexico to the state of Coahuila to camps along the new Acies and down into the Mapi Basin. They joined with the Kickapoo, who had also been pushed out. They made new homes in country where Texas law could not reach them. For a few years, it seemed possible that they had simply vanished from the story, that the Lipan would survive, far from the Rangers, who had once ridden beside them. But the story had one more turn. The Texas Rangers, as an institution, nearly died in the 1850s. Historian Walter Prescott Webb said that during that decade, they were little more than a historical expression. The U.S. Army had taken over frontier defense. The federal government did not want state militias riding around on their own. But in 1861, Texas seceded from the United States. The federal army marched out and suddenly the frontier had no defenders at all. The Rangers came back after the Civil War ended in 1865 and especially after the formal reorganization of the Texas Rangers in 1874 under a man named Major John B. Jones. The force Hayes had built began a second life, a harder life. The new Rangers were not the mixed companies of Anglo, Tejano, and Lipan that Hayes had led. They were almost entirely white. They carried Winchester rifles and improved Colt revolvers. They patrolled the border, the settled counties, and the thinning frontier. And by the 1870s, they were fighting an enemy that was no longer Comanche. By 1875, the Comanche had surrendered. The last free band of Quan Parker's Quoddy had come into Fort Sill. But the Apache, who had never been at the center of the Plains Wars, were still fighting, especially one man. His name was Victorio. His Apache name was Beduya or Bediat. He was born around 1825 in the Black Range of what is now New Mexico. He was a Chihenne Apache, also called the Warm Springs Band, a cousin people to the Lipan, a close relation to the Mescalero. American military officers who fought against Victoria respected him. Colonel Benjamin Griersonnen of the 10th Cavalry, one of his opponents, called him a sound tactician and a leader of men. Other officers called him the most skilled Apache war chief any of them had ever faced. His sister was a woman warrior named Lozan. The Apache called her a shield to her people. Alice, she rode and fought beside her brother in every major engagement of his campaign. In August of 1879, facing arrest on charges of horse theft and murder and facing the far worse fate of being forcibly moved to the desert reservation at St. Carlos, Arizona, Victorio left the Mescalero reservation with about 80 warriors and their families. And for 14 months, he fought the United States Army, the Mexican Army, the Buffalo Soldiers of the 9th and T-H Cavalry, and a unit that had been largely absent from the Indian Wars for 30 years, the Texas Rangers. The summer of 1880 in the Trans-Pecos country of far west Texas was one of the hottest and driest in memory. Victoria was moving through a country where water was the only thing that mattered. The Sierra Diablo, the Quitman Mountains, the Guadalupe Mountains, a country of mesas and arroyos and long empty valleys where a man on foot would die in 2 days without a canteen. The water holes were few. Rattlesnake Springs, Tina de las Palmas, Watanks. Colonel Grierson of the 10th Cavalry understood the country. Instead of chasing Victoria through the mountains, which was exactly what Victoria wanted him to do, Griersonnen held the waterholes. He stationed Buffalo Soldiers at every spring and every tanaga. He made the desert do his fighting for him. On July the 30th, 1880, Victorio and about 125 warriors crossed the Rio Grande into Texas. At Tanaja de las Palmas, Griersonnen and 3 Buffalo Soldier companies held the water against him. At Rattlesnake Springs, they fought a 3-hour engagement. Victoria could not break through. He turned his band back to Mexico. And it was in the days after that retreat that the Texas Rangers entered the story. In September of 1880, a company of 13 Rangers under Lieutenant George W. Baylor, along with almost 100 civilian volunteers, crossed the Rio Grande into Mexico. They were hunting Victoria. And one of the Rangers was a man named James Buchanan Gillette. He would later write a memoir about what he saw. It is one of the most detailed accounts we have of what it felt like to hunt the Apache in those final years. Gillette wrote about the country. He wrote about the heat. He wrote about the way an Apache trail disappeared across rock. He wrote about how they would find a cold campfire and know Victorio had been there, sometimes only hours before. And he wrote about something else, something that echoes back 40 years to Walker's Creek and the sentence about fingers on a hand. Gillette described the feeling of pursuing an enemy they almost never saw. He quoted an Army officer who had said it better than he could. The officer had written, "You rarely see an Indian. You see the puff of smoke and hear the whiz of his bullets, but the Indian is thoroughly hidden in his rocks." That sentence could have been written by an Apache about a Texas Ranger 40 years earlier, and it would have been just as true. Because here is something Victorio knew and something every Apache warrior knew by 1880 that the Comanche survivor at Walker's Creek had only begun to understand in 1844. The Rangers were no longer just men with revolvers. They had learned slowly, painfully how to fight the way the Apache fought. They moved at night. They made cold camps with no fire. They followed trails across bare rock by watching displaced pebbles. They pursued across state lines across the Mexican border into mountain ranges where no American cavalry had gone before. Jack Hayes back in 1840 had trained his company to ride like Comanches. 40 years later, his successors had trained themselves to ride like Apache. The Baylor expedition did not catch Victorio. Nobody did. Colonel Joaquin Terzas of the Chihuahua State Militia ordered the Texas Rangers out of Mexico in September. The Rangers had been operating across an international border without permission, and Terzas made it clear they would not be welcome any further. Gillette later wrote with a kind of grudging respect that Terzas was a noted Indian fighter in his own right, and Terzas was the one who finally found Victorio. On October 15, 1880, in a mountain range 60 miles inside Mexico called Tres Castillos, Terzas and his second-in-command Juan Mata Ortiz surrounded Victoria's camp. Victoria had sent his lieutenants Nana and Mongus out with most of the warriors to search for ammunition. He was left with a small group of men, the women, and the families. What happened at Tres Castillos was not a battle. It was something more terrible. The records suggest Victoria died there. Some say at the hand of the Mexican forces. Others say, according to Apache oral tradition, that when he realized the end had come, he chose to die by his own blade rather than be captured. Most of the Apache with him did not survive. Only some of the women and a few of the older ones were taken prisoner. They were held in Chihuahua City for years. Nana and Lozan, returning to find their leader and his camp destroyed, kept fighting. Nana, who was reputed to be over 70 years old, led a raid the following summer in 1881 across New Mexico and back. His small band of about 15 warriors fought several engagements with the United States Army, covered more than 1,000 miles, and escaped into New Mexico without being caught. It is hard to find words for what Nana did. An old man in a country of hostile armies leading a fighting retreat across 1,000 miles of desert. A Texas Ranger named James Gillette, writing about that raid years later, described Nana's campaign with something that was not quite admiration, but was very close to it. He said that the old chief had led them all at Devil's Chase. And on January 29, 1881, at a place called Wico Tanks, 30 miles east of El Paso, a company of Texas Rangers engaged a small group of Apache. It was a short fight, a skirmish really. Some records call them Guadalupe Apache, some call them Mecalero. A few survivors on both sides, but that small half-forgotten fight at Waco Tanks was the last major engagement between the Texas Rangers and Apache warriors on Texas soil. After that, the Apache Wars moved west into Arizona and New Mexico, where they would end 5 years later with the surrender of Gono. And the question, the one this whole story has been circling around, was never really answered by anyone who witnessed it directly. What did the Apache warriors say after meeting Texas Rangers for the first time? And what did they say at the end 40 years later? Some of the words survived. Most did not. Apache was not a written language in the 19th century. The words of warriors were spoken to sons and grandsons, not put into books. What little we have because ethnographers and soldiers and journalists wrote things down that they only partly understood from translators who only partly understood the original. But we have fragments. A Lipan elder interviewed in the 1930s by a linguist named Harry Hoyer described the old raids from the Texan side of the river. They used to come from the other direction too. She said they came quieter than we came. They tracked us into places we did not think they could reach. A Mess-era warrior whose name was recorded as James Quigla interviewed in the early 20th century by a historian named Yves Ball spoke about the ranger pursuit of his people during the Victory. He said through a translator, something that has stuck with historians ever since. They were not soldiers. Soldiers we could outrun. These men followed us like the Apache follows the deer. They did not give up. Another old Chiricahua man speaking to Yves Ball in the 1930s was asked about his first memory of seeing white men who fought like Apache. He did not name them as rangers specifically. He said only they had learned too much from us and we had learned too much from them. In the end we fought the same way. And so the end came. Another witness, a captured Comanche warrior who had survived a skirmish in the 1850s, when asked what he thought of the rangers by the soldiers holding him, reportedly said this. They ride like Mexicans. They trail like Indians. They shoot like Tennysons. And they fight like the devil. That sentence became so famous that for a long time people thought a white writer had made it up to flatter the Rangers. But the earliest versions of it written in the 1850s attribute it to an indigenous speaker. It was not praise. It was a warning. It was an attempt to explain to other warriors who had not yet met the Rangers what kind of men they were about to face. The Lipan Apache did not vanish. That is one of the things the textbooks sometimes get wrong. By the late 1800s, after the forced removals and the wars and the Mexican campaigns, the surviving Lipan had scattered. Some were absorbed into the Mescalero Apache tribe in New Mexico, where their descendants still live today. Some hid in plain sight in South Texas in neighborhoods of San Antonio called Indiantown in communities along the Rio Grande where a family could be lean at home and Mexican at the market. Some went to the Tonkawa Reservation in Oklahoma. Some went back to Mexico to Zaragoza in Coahuila where their grand elders still remember the old language. The Lipan Apache tribe of Texas maintains a headquarters in McAllen today. Thousands of descendants, a living nation. Even though, as of the time of this recording, they are not a federally recognized tribe in the United States. Even though they have no officially recognized land within the state of Texas, the state that bears in some ways their fingerprints on every early treaty. The Mescalero and the Chiricahua survived. Also, their descendants live today on the Mescalero Apache Reservation in New Mexico. The descendants of Victoria's people, the descendants of Lozan, the descendants of Nana who outran the United States Army when he was 70-some years old. And the Texas Rangers survived too. As an institution, they became state lawmen. They changed slowly into something very different from what they had been at Walker's Creek. The story of the Rangers after 1890 is a different story and not always a good one. But that is not the story. The story ends at the beginning. On the hill at Walker's Creek in the summer of 1844, after the Comanche had ridden away and the Rangers had dragged their dead and wounded off the slope, Jack Hayes sat down in the grass. He was, by his own admission, exhausted. "We were right glad they fled," he told Mary Maverick in the interview 12 days later. "For we were nearly used up with the fatigue of a long day's march that day and the exertions on the battlefield, and we were almost out of ammunition. 15 men almost out of ammunition, 4 wounded, 1 dying, surrounded a few hours earlier by 75 warriors, and they had won. They had won because of the revolver. They had won because of the charge. They had won because Ad Gillespie, with his last load, had put a rifle ball into the chest of a Comanche chief. But they had also won, if you want to be honest about it, because they were lucky. Frontier history, when you read enough of it, is mostly a story about luck, about who had water and who did not. about who had ammunition and who was down to his last cartridge, about whose chief fell and whose did not, about which message got through and which messenger died in a canyon with a letter still in his saddlebag. Had Gillespie missed his shot, we might know Walker's Creek today only as the place where 15 Texas Rangers rode into a trap and vanished. Had the Republic of Texas been able to purchase those 30 Colt Pattersons a year earlier or 2 years later, the entire history of Texas might have gone a different way, and had young Flaco, riding home through South Texas in December of 1842, not been ambushed by whoever it was that killed him, had he lived, the alliance between the Lipan Apache and the Texas Rangers might have held. The Apache Wars might have looked very different. Maybe no Victorio. Maybe no HO tanks. Maybe a Lipan reservation in central Texas that still exists today. We do not know. The things we do know are small. Small as the 30 Colt pistols Jack Hayes bought at a government liquidation sale. Small as a sentence about fingers on a hand. Small as a letter from Sam Houston to a grieving father promising that grass would not grow in the path between their peoples. Grass did grow. It always does. But the words survived. Some of them. Enough of them. Enough to remember that the first thing a Lipan war chief named Flaco ever said about a Texas Ranger named Jack Hayes was not a curse. It was not a threat. It was a joke between friends. Captain Jack, he brave, not afraid to go to hell by himself. And enough to remember that when a Comanche survivor of Walker's Creek tried to explain to his people what these new men were, what kind of weapon they carried, what kind of war was coming, he did not use the language of numbers or tactics or strategy. He held up his hand and he said, "A shot for every finger." If this story meant something to you, the best thing you can do is share it with one other person. Stories like this only survive when someone listens to them. Names like Flaco, names like Victorio, names like Nana, names like Lozin. They live only as long as somebody is still saying them out loud. Subscribe if you have not already. The next story I am working on is about the last free band of Lipan Apache and Kawala and what happened to them in the winter of 1873 when Colonel Ranald Mackenzie's cavalry crossed the Rio Grande without a declaration of war. Until then, ride safe and remember the Nam.